Hello and welcome to Message Joe. Subscribe to the channel by clicking on the bell to not miss new videos, and don't forget to like us because it's the best support for us. Then came the moment that still eats away at me. Rachel had stepped away to use the restroom, leaving her phone on the table next to her half-empty wine glass. For hours, my gut had been in knots, my instincts screaming that something wasn't right. All night, I had been keeping an eye on them. How Daniel leaned in a little too close when she spoke, how his hand lingered on her back just a bit too long. I sat there, gripping my scotch glass so tightly that I thought it might shatter. They thought no one noticed, but I saw everything. Every single thing. So, while she was gone, I did something I never thought I would. I reached for her phone. My hands were shaking. Can you believe that? Me, the guy who dissects legal arguments for a living, was trembling like some nervous kid. I didn't even know what I was looking for. A part of me was praying I'd find nothing, that I was just being paranoid, and I'd laugh at myself later. But deep down, a part of me already knew the truth. I just didn't want to admit it yet. I unlocked her phone. Of course, I knew her passcode. We were married after all, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I started scrolling through her recent messages, seeing nothing unusual at first, just the normal chats with coworkers and a few friends. My breathing was shallow, my eyes darting from word to word, praying I'd come up empty. But then I saw it, a message from Daniel. Of all people, it had to be Daniel. At first glance, it didn't look like much. Can't wait to see you tonight. Winky face, that's all it said. 7 words. 7 goddamn words that turned my entire world upside down. On its own, it could have been an innocent message, something you'd send a friend before meeting up. But that stupid winking emoji at the end, it felt like a punch to the gut. That wink made it clear this wasn't just a casual, friendly message. There was something more behind it, something hidden in plain sight. I felt my blood run cold. The words blurred as I sat there, stunned. I scrolled up, desperately hoping to find some kind of explanation, some way to convince myself that I was wrong. But the more I read, the worse it got. They weren't idiots. They hadn't sent anything explicit, but the subtext was undeniable. There was a connection between them that went beyond friendship, filled with inside jokes and flirtatious remarks. Things like, "Remember last time?" Winky face, and "Hope we can find a better spot tonight." It didn't take a genius to figure out what they were really talking about. As I stared at the screen, it felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my best friend, was collapsing like a house of cards. You know those scenes in movies where time slows down, and the main character feels like they're outside their own body? That's exactly how it felt. I was watching my whole world fall apart in slow motion, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I must have read that message a dozen times, trying to make sense of it. My heart was racing, my palms were sweaty, and the noise of the party around me faded into the background. For a brief second, I even considered putting her phone back, pretending I hadn't seen anything. Maybe I was blowing this out of proportion, right? Maybe it was just my paranoia talking. But the pit in my stomach said otherwise. This wasn't innocent. This was betrayal, pure and simple, and I was teetering on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. When Rachel came back from the restroom, she had no idea the storm that was brewing inside me. She smiled, asked if I wanted another drink, totally clueless that her entire act was about to collapse. I slid her phone back onto the table before she could see that I had been holding it, trying to play it cool, even though I felt like I was about to explode. I forced a smile and nodded, my throat tight, my mind screaming at me to confront her. But I couldn't. Not yet. That's when I realized our marriage was hanging by a thread, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to save it. I sat there, staring at her, my heart pounding, knowing that from this point on, everything had changed forever. But I needed more proof. As much as that text gnawed at me, there was still a small part of me hoping I was wrong. Maybe my imagination was running wild, feeding off jealousy and suspicion. Maybe that message didn't mean what I thought it did. I tried to convince myself it could be innocent, that I was overthinking it all. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. I needed something more concrete, because if I was going to confront Rachel and tear our life apart, I couldn't afford to be wrong. So, one evening, when she told me she'd be working late, I made a decision. Yeah, I know it sounds like something out of a bad detective show, but desperate times call for desperate measures. She had been staying late at work a lot lately, claiming she had big projects, important meetings, and tight deadlines. I had bought her excuses for weeks, trying to be the supportive husband. But that night, I wasn't going to be played for a fool anymore. I waited until she left, her heels clicking down the driveway, her perfume hanging in the air like a bitter reminder of everything wrong. I gave her a few minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. My heart was racing as I kept my distance, making sure she didn't spot me. It didn't take long to see she wasn't heading to the office. She was driving toward the city, and alarm bells went off in my head. What business did she have downtown if she was supposed to be working late? After about 20 minutes, she pulled into the parking lot of one of those small, rundown hotels. You know the type? Cheap, quiet, tucked away where no one asks questions. The kind of place where people sneak off for a few hours to do things they don't want anyone else to know about. My stomach twisted into knots as I parked down the street, far enough that she wouldn't notice me, but close enough to keep my eyes on her. I watched as she stepped out of the car, glancing around, obviously making sure no one was watching. And then, like clockwork, he appeared. Daniel. There he was, my best friend, walking toward her like he didn't have a care in the world. Like he wasn't about to meet my wife at some grimy little hotel. I clenched the steering wheel so tight, I thought I might snap it in half. My chest felt like it was being crushed, and I could hear the thundering pulse in my ears as I sat there, watching a nightmare play out in real time. They didn't even bother with any pretense. As soon as Daniel reached her, he slipped his arm around her waist like it was the most natural thing in the world, pulling her in close. I held my breath as I watched him lower his head and kiss her. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't rushed, wasn't some guilty, fleeting peck. No, it was intimate, like they'd done this 100 times before. The way their bodies moved together, fitting so perfectly, it was clear this wasn't their first time. Not by a long shot. I sat there, numb, watching my wife, the woman I had loved for over a decade, fall into the arms of another man. Not just any man. My best friend. My brother. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, completely wrapped up in each other, totally unaware that I was sitting just yards away, taking it all in. It was humiliating. I felt like the biggest fool on the planet. Like every happy moment we'd shared, every tender memory, had been a lie. And I was the sucker who hadn't seen it coming. The pain stabbed at me with every passing second. But beneath that pain was something even darker. I was angry. No, scratch that. I was furious. But even in that moment, as I watched them laughing quietly, walking toward the hotel entrance, I didn't let myself snap. I couldn't. Not yet. I wanted to charge out of the car and confront them right then and there. I wanted to scream, to knock Daniel's smug face into the dirt, and drag Rachel out by her hair. But what good would that have done? That would have been too easy for them. I wasn't about to let them see me crumble. So, I stayed in the car, seething silently, every muscle in my body trembling with the effort of holding myself together. Because I had a plan. This wasn't going to end on their terms. I wasn't going to be the guy who gets cheated on and just takes it. Hell no. I was going to make sure they paid for what they did. But I needed time. I needed to think. So, instead of storming into that hotel, I turned the key in the ignition and drove away, leaving them to their little rendezvous. My revenge was starting to take shape in my mind, and once it was done, it wasn't going to be pretty. Revenge couldn't be rushed. I had to be smart, careful. I needed to collect every bit of information before I made my move. So, I became a shadow, always trailing them, staying just out of sight but never letting them know I was there. I started by recording their phone calls. Rachel had become predictable, always stepping outside to take her work calls, thinking I wasn't paying attention. I installed a program on her phone, something I got from a tech-savvy client, so I could listen to everything. I followed her when she claimed she was working late watching her meet Daniel in their regular spots. The fury inside me grew stronger with every new piece of evidence I gathered, but I didn't let it consume me. Not yet. I didn't just want to expose them. That would have been too easy. Sure, if I told everyone they'd been screwing around behind my back, it'd cause a stir, maybe even a scandal. But after a while, they'd move on. I wanted them to feel the same gut-wrenching humiliation I had been living with since I saw that first text. They needed to suffer, and I was going to make damn sure they did. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from Samantha, Daniel's wife. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. On the surface, she and Daniel always seemed like the perfect couple, the ones everyone envied. If I was blindsided by Rachel's betrayal, I couldn't even imagine what Samantha must have been going through. But when she called, she sounded surprisingly calm. At first, I didn't think much of it, just small talk, the usual pleasantries. But there was something off about her voice, a hesitation, like she was working up the courage to ask me something she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. After a long pause, she finally got to the point. "Ryan, I've been meaning to ask you, do you think Daniel might be seeing someone?" Her voice wavered just enough for me to catch the pain she was holding back. My throat tightened, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. How the hell was I supposed to answer that? She was probably just starting to suspect something, while I already had the full, ugly truth. I couldn't just unload it all on her in one phone call. So I stayed quiet for a moment, trying to figure out what to say. And in that silence, she kept talking, as though she needed to fill the void with her own doubts. She told me how Daniel had been working late more and more, how he'd grown distant, distracted. She'd wondered if there was someone else, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. She didn't want to be that wife, the one who assumes the worst without proof. But now, the pieces were starting to come together, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wanted to lay it all out right then and there. I wanted to tell Samantha the whole truth, that not only was her husband cheating on her, but he was doing it with my wife. But something held me back. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just didn't want to see the devastation on her face. The same look that had crushed me when I found out. So instead, I just listened. I let her talk, spilling her suspicions and fears, everything she'd been bottling up. And then she asked the question that made my heart skip a beat. "Ryan," she said, her voice soft and almost fragile. Do you think something's going on?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, and I knew I couldn't keep lying to her. I'd been carrying this secret for too long, and it was eating me alive. So I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. My voice came out thick and strained. "Yes, Samantha, I do." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her putting the pieces together in her head. But instead of the meltdown I half expected, she stayed quiet. Then, in a calm voice I didn't see coming, she said something that caught me completely off guard. "Let's meet." We met the next day at a small cafe, the kind of place that's easy to overlook. I arrived first, and when she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. Samantha had always been the picture of poise, but now she looked worn down, almost hollow. She sat across from me, avoiding eye contact, nervously stirring her coffee as if it held the answers she was looking for. Neither of us knew how to start, so we just sat there in that awkward silence for what felt like forever. Finally, she broke the tension, her voice quiet but steady. "He's been different, Ryan. Distant. He's always coming home late, making excuses. It's like he's not even there anymore." I sat there, gripping the table, trying to find the words. How do you tell someone their entire world is about to collapse? I wanted to protect her from the truth, but I knew I couldn't shield her from it any longer. When she looked at me, her eyes pleading for an answer, and asked, "Do you think he's cheating on me?" I couldn't hold back. "I think he is," I said, my voice barely holding together. "And I think it's with Rachel." Her expression changed in an instant. The sadness in her eyes hardened into something cold, determined. But she didn't cry. She didn't break down. Instead, she leaned in, her voice low but full of resolve. "Then let's make them pay." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for revenge. And in that moment, I realized we were on the same page. Neither of us was going to play the victim. We were going to take back control together. I nodded, my mind already working on the details. We were going to do this right. When we were finished, Daniel and Rachel wouldn't know what hit them. From that day on, Samantha and I started meeting more often. At first, it was all about planning, figuring out how to catch them in the act, but there was something else between us, something unspoken that grew stronger with each meeting. We were both wrecked by the betrayal of the people we loved most. And in that shared devastation, we found a connection. She understood me in a way no one else could. And the more we talked, the closer we became. She'd vent about Daniel, and I'd pour out my anger about Rachel. But underneath it all, there was this simmering tension, like something was waiting to explode. One evening, Samantha came over to my place. It had become a routine, dinners, late-night talks, plotting out our next move. But that night felt different. I'd cooked us dinner, something simple, but I barely paid attention to the food. Our conversation was strained. We talked about our plan, how we'd expose them, how we'd make them pay. But there was something else in the air, something heavier. I could feel it, and I knew she could too. She looked incredible that night. Her long, dark hair flowed over her shoulders, and her eyes, which usually held so much sadness, now sparkled with something else, something raw. She wore a simple black dress, nothing too revealing, but it hugged her body in all the right ways. I tried to keep my focus on our conversation, but my eyes kept drifting to her lips, her neck, the way she moved. After dinner, we didn't get up right away. We just sat there, the silence between us thick and electric. I could feel her eyes on me, and when I finally looked at her, she wasn't looking away. She was staring right at me, and in that moment, everything else disappeared. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice soft but firm, "we're just as much cheaters as they are." Her words hit me hard, but she wasn't finished. "But I can't keep this bottled up anymore." Her hand reached out, resting on my shoulder, and her touch sent a jolt through me. My breath caught in my throat. We both knew what was about to happen. Part of me wanted to stop it, to pull back before things went too far. But another part of me, the part that had been buried for so long, wanted this, needed this. It was like all the anger, the betrayal, the hurt was bubbling over, and she was the only one who understood it. I leaned in, our faces just inches apart, and before I knew it, our lips crashed together. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was fierce, desperate, like we were pouring all our pain into that kiss. Her lips were soft, her breath shaky, and as I pulled her closer, I felt her body melt against mine. There was no stopping now. We didn't stop. I grabbed her by the waist, lifting her onto my lap, and she matched my intensity, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer like she couldn't get enough. We stumbled to the couch, a chaotic mess of raw emotion and desire. I hadn't felt this kind of passion in years, not with Rachel, not with anyone. Samantha's touch, the heat of her skin against mine, it was everything I'd been missing for so long. The anger, the betrayal, it all melted away as we got lost in each other. Her dress slid off effortlessly, and soon we were a tangle of limbs, moving together with an urgency that took me by surprise. This wasn't just about sex. It was about reclaiming something we'd both been robbed of, something our spouses had taken from us. Her moans filled the room as we moved from the couch to the floor, then to the bedroom, and even the bathroom. Neither of us wanted to stop. Neither of us wanted to come down from the high of losing ourselves, if only for a few hours. The sex was wild, primal, almost chaotic, a storm of emotions wrapped up in heat and flesh. We were two broken people, using each other as a temporary escape from the wreckage our lives had become. And for those few hours, it worked. I wasn't thinking about Rachel or Daniel or the mess of betrayal. I was focused on Samantha, on her body, her warmth, the breathless sound she made in my ear. But afterward, when the heat faded and reality crept back in, I lay there staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all pressing down on me like a boulder. Samantha was asleep beside me, her body curled up against mine, but I couldn't shut my eyes. The truth gnawed at me, tearing at my insides. I had betrayed Rachel, yes, but more than that, I had betrayed myself. By crossing that line, I had become the very thing I despised. I had sunk to their level, and no amount of revenge or satisfaction was going to change that. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't just the sex, it was the realization that I had gone too far, both physically and morally. The floodgates had opened, and all the anger, the betrayal, and the pain I had been burying for so long came rushing out. Samantha and I continued seeing each other, but every time we met, there was a new tension between us. The passion was undeniable, but so was the growing fear of getting caught. We were both playing a dangerous game, and we knew it. Still, she was the only one who understood me during that time. With Samantha, I didn't have to put on the act, the composed, successful lawyer who had it all together. She saw through the facade. And as much as we tried to stay focused on our original plan, to bring Rachel and Daniel down, the lines between revenge and something more personal kept blurring. Our conversations became more strained, our meetings charged with a mix of desire and guilt. But despite it all, we couldn't keep away from each other. We were both too deep in. Meanwhile, things with Rachel spiraled further into a void. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was like talking to a stranger. The warmth, the love, everything that had once kept us together was long gone. Our conversations were nothing but cold, clinical exchanges, like two people forced to share the same space, but with nothing left to say. I couldn't take it anymore. I was done pretending to be the clueless husband, the fool. But I wasn't going to walk away as the defeated one. No, after everything I'd uncovered about her affair with Daniel, I was determined to leave with my dignity intact. If anyone was going to take the hit, it was going to be Rachel. I had to act fast, and I had to be ruthless. Then came the call that changed everything. It was my private investigator. After weeks of tailing them, digging into their every move, he had finally delivered the one thing that would seal the deal: proof. Real, hard, undeniable proof. A folder packed with photos, videos, and screenshots of their conversations. There it all was, in living color. Rachel and Daniel, caught red-handed at that damn hotel. I now had everything I needed, not just to confront her, but to crush her in court. With cheaters, you don't play fair, and I wasn't about to start now. The moment I held that folder in my hands, everything clicked. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when I could take control of the narrative. I wasn't going to let Rachel twist the story or play the victim. This was my move. That evening, I set the stage. I cooked dinner, not anything special, just enough to make it seem like a normal night. I poured some wine, lit a few candles, and waited. I needed to stay calm, to make everything seem routine. When Rachel walked in, she was already suspicious. I saw it in the way she hesitated at the door, how her eyes darted around the room, trying to piece together what was going on. But she still sat down at the table, took a sip of wine, and forced a smile. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady, though my heart was hammering in my chest. I watched as Rachel's hand gripped her wine glass, just a little tighter. I eased into the conversation slowly, almost gently, like there was nothing really wrong. I didn't want her to see what was coming. But the moment she started with her excuses, trying to explain away her late nights, pretending like everything was still fine, that's when I pulled out the photos. I laid them out on the table one by one. There she was with Daniel standing too close in that hotel parking lot. Another of them holding hands, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. And then the last one, a picture of them kissing outside the hotel. The blood drained from her face, and she went pale, staring at the photos, her hands shaking. "How could you do this?" she finally shouted, her voice cracking between fear and anger. But there wasn't an ounce of remorse in her eyes. Just shocked that she had been caught. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just looked at her, my words cold and sharp. You're the one who destroyed us, Rachel. Not me. I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. I'm filing for divorce. And just so you know, I've already talked to my lawyer. That last part hit her hard. She hadn't expected me to be in control. She thought she could somehow weasel her way out of this, maybe even turn the tables on me. But now she was realizing just how wrong she had been. I wasn't the naive, clueless husband she thought I was. I had the proof, the leverage, and the upper hand. Rachel sat there, stunned, her eyes darting between the photos and me, trying to figure out what her next move could possibly be. But it was too late. I'd already made mine, and there was no going back. The next day, I filed for divorce, armed with all the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I hired one of the best divorce lawyers in town, someone as cutthroat as I needed them to be. My goal was simple. Rachel was going to walk away with nothing. I demanded half of everything, our assets, the house, the cars, everything we had built together. But I didn't stop there. I made sure I positioned myself to gain financial control. I wasn't just walking away. I was going to win. After the papers were filed, things moved faster than I had expected. Rachel, who thought she could salvage her reputation, quickly found herself overwhelmed. But it was far too late for damage control. Word of her affair with Daniel spread like wildfire through our social circles. She lost several key work contracts, her clients cutting ties with her almost overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the scandal. The harder she tried to hold on, the faster everything slipped away. And Daniel? That arrogant bastard thought he could skate by unscathed. He was wrong. Samantha made sure of that. She had stayed quiet at first, letting me take the lead with Rachel, but then she struck when it mattered most. Right after I filed for divorce, Samantha filed hers, and she didn't pull any punches. Her testimony was brutal, exposing Daniel's affair, his negligence, and some shady business dealings he thought no one knew about. Her accusations tore him apart, not just personally, but professionally. The real twist came when Samantha and I decided to join forces in more ways than one. While Daniel was too busy dealing with his crumbling personal life, I made my move on his business. I struck deals with his key clients, the ones who could see that Daniel's empire was falling apart and wanted to switch sides. They came over to me without hesitation. Soon, Daniel's entire business was in freefall. Contracts were lost, money was bleeding out, and lawsuits started piling up. There was no escape for him. He thought he could walk away unscathed, but Samantha and I made sure that didn't happen. Daniel's downfall was swift and brutal. Both his business and personal life were in ruins. And watching him crash and burn gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Not because I took pleasure in his suffering, but because it was proof that I had won. I hadn't let him or Rachel break me. I had taken control and made them pay for what they did. A few weeks after the dust settled, Samantha and I met again. But this time, it wasn't about revenge or celebrating our victories. Something had shifted between us. We had become more than just partners in this twisted game. Our relationship had deepened. The passion we once shared wasn't just raw anger and lust anymore. It had grown into something real. The sex wasn't wild and reckless like before. It had become something emotional, something that felt like the beginning of a genuine connection. Samantha understood me in ways no one else ever had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. Months passed, and the divorce was finalized. I walked away with the house, a significant portion of our assets, and full control of the business Daniel and I had once shared. Rachel was left with nothing. She tried to piece her life back together, but without me to fall back on, she struggled. Her betrayal cost her more than just our marriage. It cost her everything. As for Daniel, he wasn't much better off. With debts mounting and his reputation in shambles, he was left to drown in the wreckage of his own making. Samantha left him, and there was no one to help him pick up the pieces. Samantha and I didn't have to hide anymore. Our relationship became public, and we didn't care what people thought. We had survived the storm together, and now we were building something real. We weren't just two broken people seeking revenge anymore. We had both come out on top, and we were ready to move forward, leaving Rachel and Daniel in the wreckage of their own choices. I stood there, looking at everything I had gained, my freedom, my business, my future with Samantha, and all I felt was victory. I had played the game coldly, calculated every step, and emerged the winner. And the best part? I didn't regret a single thing.